No Other Life presents Upstaged. Building Respite. I've talked to you a number of times in these episodes about a few failed albums that just didn't come out, and I gave a few reasons for that being the case, and you can hear those episodes. But there was a first album that literally never happened. There was a second one called A Friend in the Dark, which did come out just quite a bit later than I anticipated. And it didn't end up being my first release, but I'm over that now. But this was going to be an album that was going to just come out kind of happenstancely. I had been doing some experimentation with recording and writing music, and I'd written a few things that I liked. Actually, I loved them. I was very proud of them. But now I've come to see them a little differently, and they haven't been released. And part of the reason for that was because they were using a style that I now somewhat disdainfully refer to as the kitchen sink approach, which was I have all of these instruments that I own. I have all of these different sounds, different libraries from different publishers, all sorts of audio. So just use all of it. And I came to realize that I am not so thrilled about the sound of an album that lacks cohesion between tracks. And what that means for me is, even though I have all of these instruments, I like to think about a palette now. Probably the best example of this, I think, would be my album Another Town, which was the first to really focus with one template and say, we are going to use these instruments. Now, do I have many other instruments? Yeah. Do I have maybe a few places in that album where something else will punctuate? Sure. But that's not absurd in the real world. If you have a string quartet but all of a sudden need a flute, well, you get a flutist and you have that part covered. And so it's not like I am going against some tradition. It's just something that I've come to start to like. And so in that other failed album, I had all the instruments I could possibly think of in one track. And then on the next song, it would be like all the instruments plus all of these other ones that I didn't use. And I heard it said once that if Video Killed the Radio Star were a live performance, it would need, I mean, these are wildly different figures, but either 30 or 60 players, I can't recall. But in either case, that was something that kind of spoke to me. It made me say, well, wait a minute. If I want to sound homogeneous, if I want to sound like something real and authentic, then I probably shouldn't have, this menagerie of sounds on each and every track being independent from all the others. Again, just my own personal preference, but it has stuck with me now for some time. So when I began to work on this track, which ends up being called Respite, I really had no idea that it was going to be a pivotal moment in my creativity. And the reason that I say that is because I planned that it was going to come at the end of this album, which was probably 4 other tracks. It was totally experimental, brand new to me. So 4 or 5 tracks on an EP seemed just fine. and it was going to come at the end. I think it might have even been called Epilogue at one point. I always have a lot of different working titles. And now there is a different piece in my library called Epilogue. So this one definitely not being called that now. And the reason that it was somewhat different was because I decided that it was going to use elements from all the other pieces on that EP. Now, the piano part that is the main instrument here, as usual, was, I believe, totally original to this and probably came mostly off of just an improv session. But that was the only original to this track material. Now, the other parts were going to come from other pieces. And I thought this would be a fun exercise because all those pieces weren't in the same key. All those pieces didn't have exactly the same instrumentation. This was the kitchen sink period that I'm talking about. And so it was going to be a nice challenge to first find elements of the other tracks that appealed to me. Some kind of unsung part, so not the main melody or the most familiar part. I wasn't trying to create like a Broadway overture that shows you all the exciting melodies of the pieces that were featured, but I wanted to use these unsung parts. And I've always been fascinated by counter melody. I've always been fascinated by like alto lines and tenor lines in choral pieces. The viola part. Some viola parts are just absurdly cool, and they're just tucked in there, filling in holes and filling in spaces where they're needed. But when you hear them on your own, if you're not the person playing the viola part, you might not even recognize what piece of music it came from, even if it's one of your favorites. And that's totally true. I witness that all the time when I'm just poking around with an orchestral score at the piano. And so I found these unsung, I keep saying unsung, and then by that I just don't mean anything about the voice. I just mean unheralded, these parts that just fill in the background. And I needed to figure out how to fit them in around this original piano part, and that is where it really got fun, because they weren't meant to be in the same key as it, they were meant to complement it. And so I was thinking primarily as I understand like a Renaissance composer to be thinking. So purely how well do the lines sound together? Now, historically speaking, after that period, when we get into the Baroque and the classical eras, we start to be thinking more vertically. We say, well, what chord am I trying to have here? And how will I fill that in with the voices? But in the Renaissance, you just said, oh, here's the melody. That sounds cool. Here's another melody, or maybe the same exact one staggered a bit. How can I fit it in and make it sound good in a horizontal fashion, meaning just as it flows, but not really caring, was that an A minor chord and should it be followed by a D minor? Not like that at all. And so I was trying to think in those terms, which meant that I'd pull out one of these unheralded parts. I would decide what octave I wanted it to be in. I would decide what voice to give it. And then I was basically just nudging it up. Half step, I don't know. Half step, that's interesting. Half step, I don't know. And I would just try a lot of permutations, a lot of different ways that this could be stacked with itself and with the other parts that were also unheralded and chosen kind of at random. And what ends up happening is that you don't really hear key so much. When you're listening to it, I certainly don't think it sounds nuts or avant-garde or anything. It still feels to me, although I've heard it hundreds of times now, it still feels sonorous. It still feels melodic. It still feels like it makes sense with itself. But knowing how it got created makes me think differently about it. Now, one of the big moments for this piece comes right at the very end, and I'm going to be talking about that in 2 complementary episodes here. Trying something a little different here with the Upstage podcast this year summer. And so I'll talk about that later, but it's in the mandolin voice. And from a compositional standpoint, this is something that I had to look up. So on my tracks in the session for this piece, rather than writing the names of the instruments, I wrote the name of the track that they came from the piece of music that they came from. And so I had to go back recently and look to see what this was called, because then I was able to go to the track of music that it didn't ever get published and try to say, well, wait a minute, where is that part even? And it turns out it was deep in the texture. I think it was maybe in the bass line or something. I don't remember now. I should. But I raised it up and made it higher and more prominent and made it more into the melody just by the way that it got balanced out. And I'm really happy with that. And that particular voice really meant something very important to me. And you'll learn about that in the next episode. But for the time being, here is a full playthrough of this piece called Respite. It ended up being the last track on my album, A Friend in the Dark. And I hope that you can enjoy it. That was the last track from my album, A Friend in the Dark. It's called Respite. And if you really enjoyed learning more about how that song got created, I would invite you to tune in and subscribe for the upcoming episodes of this podcast, where I'm going to tell you 2 other kind of angles on it and how it works out for me. You can either subscribe to that, or you can head over to rickchome.com for latest news, archived social media, and to purchase any of the music you hear on the podcast. Both Upstaged and the No Other Life project are independently conceived of and managed by me, Rick Seaholm, ad-free and without interruption for all listeners, and I appreciate all your support. I invite you to please subscribe, leave a review, and just spread the word. It's definitely the number one way this can keep going. Friends, you have no other life, and it's the grandest improv session of them all. Own what you bring to the scene and share it with all whom you meet.